Hi class, this is the first of the lecture videos on Plato's Apology, and I just wanted to say a couple of things by way of introduction. First, we're going to look at this text pretty closely. If this was a normal semester, we would end up spending a week and a half on it. And so do expect to get into a little more depth here, but don't necessarily expect that with all the readings in this course, because in addition to the content that's there, we're going to be using it, as I mentioned last video, to kind of draw out and isolate some arguments that are in the text, which are what we talked about as philosophical arguments. And so we're not, it's really good practice to take step by step in a way that we won't necessarily be doing with readings throughout the semester. So that's thing one. Thing two, though, the breaks in these videos are very intentional. If I say between this video and the next one, go do X, you really should do X. Now, not because I'm some authoritarian who's going to spank you if you don't, but simply because this is how you're going to learn best. And so my advice is such that I'm trying to cultivate the right kinds of lessons to be taken from the reading. So just be advised on that. Don't go through these videos as quickly as possible. That's not going to be the best for your learning. Just like in a normal lecture, I would tell you to do things between classes. So that's that. Before I just hop right into the text here, I want to remind of a few things. First of all, even though the name is Plato's Apology, you should really think of that as Socrates' Apologia. It is a defense made by Socrates. And just big picture, when we're talking about Plato's dialogues, as we will read several this semester, people divide Plato's dialogues into early, middle, and late. The early Plato dialogues are historical, where Plato used to follow Socrates around and basically write down these conversations that the historical Socrates had. And middle Plato is where Plato went on to develop his own metaphysics, his own philosophical notions in some detail. And then late Plato, well, Plato had this very smart student named Aristotle who pointed out some problems with some of Plato's theories, and you can see late Plato is making things a little more complicated, but necessarily so in light of some worries and criticisms. Having said that, we are going to be reading some early Plato and some middle Plato in this course. And the reason this is important is, remember, early Plato isn't Plato at all, it's Socrates. So if on the exam I ask you a question about Socrates' philosophy, I expect you to know what that means. It's going to come from the early Plato dialogues, in this case, the Apology, and the other one we'll read is the Crito. Both of those are Socrates' philosophy. However, if I ask you about Plato's view, then you should be thinking about middle Plato. The text we'll read in this course from middle Plato is the Euthyphro. So just be advised on that important distinction. Next thing that's worth talking about is, just to set the scene, the Apology takes place in ancient Athens, Greece, and during this time in Athens, it was a democracy. So, having said that, there's two important differences between Athens and, say, the United States. One, of course, is that Athens is a direct democracy. What that means is everyone votes on every issue instead of electing representatives. And of course, by everyone, we mean non-slave males. But that's one difference. The second difference is we have this thing that's theoretically supposed to protect our rights called a constitution. Ancient Athens didn't have that. And so put those two things together and something very troubling can happen. If you are sufficiently unpopular, then someone can simply bring charges up against you as a criminal and maybe try to get you exiled, etc. And this is exactly, sorry, the shirt's bothering me. This is exactly what's happening in the Apology. And so, in essence, Socrates is defending himself against the charge of unpopularity, as we will see. So that's just something to bear in mind. So, given all of that, Socrates, the first thing he needs to do in his defense, again, this is after the prosecution has had its say, he's going to distinguish between what he calls the old charges and the new charges. This is a very important distinction. So what was this distinction? What he calls the new charges are actually just the official legal charges that were brought against him. This was corrupting the youth of Athens and denying the gods of Athens. When he says the new charges, that's what he means, the legal charges. Well, what about these old charges? The old charges are basically what we started talking about, roughly speaking, his reputation and his unpopularity. And for Socrates, he thinks that's the real issue, and a lot of readers think that. So just remembering that Socrates doesn't need to prove himself innocent, just like in the U.S., give sufficient cause for doubt. Having read the whole Apology, does it seem like he corrupted the youth? Does it seem like he denied the gods of Athens? No, of course not. And so those were weak charges. Those were not very good. And so Socrates says, let's talk about the real reason we're here. The real reason I'm here isn't these BS charges. It's because of my unpopularity, the old charges. And so he thinks those are much more important. And so he's going to address those first. And so will we. So if you're talking about reputation, there's a small kind of funny aside, and then there's the more serious one. So the small kind of funny aside that your textbook notes, Socrates knew Aristophanes, the comedic playwright. And, they're probably friends is a good word to describe them. But in one of Aristophanes' plays, he imagined this just imaginary silly school of philosophy. If you're thinking Monty Python, you're on the right track. And in this purely fictitious play, there was a character, Socrates. For instance, there's this long soliloquy in the middle of the play where the character Socrates gives this horribly complex, abstruse argument whose conclusion is that he can fly. And then he just flies off stage right. That's the kind of just over-the-top silliness that was in this play. But if you hadn't met Socrates, one knee-jerk reaction might be, you mean that idiot who convinced himself to fly in Aristophanes' play? So that's one little bit of reputation. Having said that, that's not the important one, because the important one for Socrates is where he irritated the wrong people. And this has to do with the Oracle of Delphi and Socrates' quest. So hopefully you caught that from the reading. First of all, who was the Oracle of Delphi, also known as the Pythian Oracle? Theoretically, this was the mouthpiece of Apollo, god of light, prophecy, and the Greek spirit. Delphi was at the center of the world, literally the navel of the world. And it was thought that whatever the oracle says, just treat that as Apollo saying it. And according to the Oracle of Delphi, sorry, let me back that up. One of Socrates' friends went to the Oracle of Delphi, and the oracle said that none were wiser than Socrates. And that's pretty serious. Maybe you might think, oh, oracles are superstitious and silly nowadays. Well, separate issue. But it certainly wasn't back then. To put this at its most forceful, I am pretty confident saying that none of us would be sitting here right now in this life in the 21st century in the U.S. if not for the Oracle of Delphi. Let me justify that a little bit. Second Persian invasion into Greece. Persia landed a huge army. Nobody really knows exactly how many, but somewhere between 250,000 and 1.2 million. A hostile force landed in Greece. So this would be the equivalent of somebody landing like 500 million combatant soldiers on U.S. soil. More than every man, woman, and child. So, and this was Greece, right? This is the area and time known as the cradle of Western civilization, where we get wonderful ideas like philosophy and democracy and medicine and all of that good stuff that made us basically into the society that we know today. Just complete threat to the very way of existence we think about in the West. Greece had no idea what to do. Their military was completely, totally outmatched. What did they do? They went and asked the oracle how to beat the Persians. And the oracle told them. The Greeks beat the Persians, and here we sit today. Thanks, Oracle of Delphi. Probably would not have been born without you. So, when the oracle says this is as serious as a heart attack. What you don't do is say, oracles. And you don't say, oh, the oracle must have been wrong. No, those don't even cross into your mind. And yet, when Socrates heard this, his first thought was he was puzzled. He was confused. He had always thought of himself as bereft of wisdom. He liked to describe himself as a midwife of ideas. He didn't have any of his own, but he helped people birth theirs. And so Socrates was puzzled. Having said that, Socrates was also a philosopher. Remember before, Socrates is known as the father of Western philosophy. When a philosopher is puzzled, they ask that all-important question, why? Why is no one wiser than me according to the oracle? That's a really important question, Socrates thinks. And so he sets up what you might call a research program. He says, okay, well, why don't I investigate these people that society thinks is wise and try to figure out why it's the case that they are not wiser than I am? And so that's what he does. We will do this in kind of order of importance rather than the oracle, rather than the order he gives in the text. So first off, he goes to the poets. And ancient Greek poetry was a little different. It often involved huffing a lot of fumes and then writing about visions. But what he found, and again, hopefully you're pulling this stuff out of the text. What he found is, well, the poets could create these wonderful, beautiful, visionary things, but they did not themselves understand it, and they had to rely on others to interpret their work. This is not a perfect. This is not a perfect, clearly articulated point if you're thinking of contemporary poetry. But maybe a better analogy if you think of the post-realist art movement, where a lot of the traditional structures have been broken down, etc. So, well, to take one of the more famous cases, there was an artist who would hang these just dirty, disgusting urinals in the middle of an art gallery. And so imagine someone does that, and then you're like, ew, I don't get it at all. And then the art critic comes up and tells you why this is a brilliant maneuver. Well, in that situation, who has the wisdom? It seems to be the art critic, the one interpreting the work. And so that's the problem with the poets, according to Socrates. Well, the wisdom doesn't lie there. The wisdom lies with the interpretation. So there's reason to think that the poets are not wiser than Socrates. The next one he goes to, very philosophically important, are the craftsmen or artisans, depending on your translation. And this is philosophically important because it really teaches us something today that is worth emphasizing over and over and over again. What am I talking about here? Well, what was the problem? So, unlike the poets, the craftsmen knew their craft, of course. The computer technician knows computers, etc., etc. Sure, says Socrates, that's not the problem. The problem is that they think that because they know their craft, they think that makes them qualified to talk about other topics. You know, if anyone has ever been condescended to like they were a 5-year-old because they didn't know computers as well as the IT person, you kind of know what Socrates is talking about there. They knew their craft, but they didn't stop there. They thought that made them qualified to talk about other things. Now, first of all, this answers the oracle's riddle. Why? The oracle said no one was wiser than Socrates. But where was Socrates wiser than the craftsman? Not in the craft, but that a concept sometimes called Socratic wisdom. Socrates was wise in that he knew he wasn't wise. Socrates was wise enough to say, I don't know, when he didn't know. So that's Socratic wisdom, is to know your limits, know what you know and what you don't. Don't be afraid of saying the I don't know. But this teaches us a couple of things, and just our society is really bad at this because our society puts a huge emphasis on confidence, and we don't like to appear unconfident, and we don't like to say I don't know, but we really should, especially when we don't know. So let's say a couple of things about this because this is again one of the important philosophical topics here. First of all, it kind of reminds us when we should be listening and when we shouldn't. Ties back to inductive arguments. If I want to know about economics, you know who I ask? Not Clint Eastwood. I ask an economist. And this example is not facetious at all. 2008 Republican National Convention, there's Clint Eastwood doing a speech on economics. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Clint Eastwood knows his craft. He knows acting and directing, especially directing, really well. But that doesn't make him an expert in economics, which means I really shouldn't be listening to him about economics. I should be listening to an economist. Or more recently, I love listening to Kardashians talk about healthcare. They are not experts in healthcare. We should listen to scientists about science, climatologists about climate. We should listen to constitutional lawyers about gun rights, not Ted Nugent, etc. So why do people listen to celebrities? Because celebrities are familiar. There's a psychological effect that we are much more likely to listen to someone if we know them. In case you're wondering why Morgan Freeman does 1,000 voiceovers. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we can, in addition to talking about these big national level things in celebrities, this is a problem that occurs all the time. Imagine if an abortion debate on Facebook started, well, I don't really know enough about the biology or the biomedical ethics involved to have knowledge about abortion, and so I'm going to state my conclusions very tentatively and carefully. Now, no one does that, and yet, if you can't tell me quite a few important things about the gestation of a fetus, you're probably just blowing smoke on that particular topic. And so let's pause here. This is a great thing to talk about in your discussion boards. Well, is Socratic wisdom important? Is it wise to act this way? Is it beneficial? If so, how? What are some examples of people ignoring it? And again, you can talk about celebrities and politicians if you want, but I always feel like that's kind of cheating. If you want to make fun of people in public discourse for bad reasoning, it's not hard. If you really want the most bang for your buck, talk about when you do it, because in critical thinking, the thoughts we must be most critical of are our own. So, when do we ignore Socratic wisdom and listen to the wrong people, or act as though we have knowledge that we don't? And what kind of harm does that do? What benefits are there to recognizing it, etc.? We should really not be afraid to say, I don't know, because saying you do know when you don't causes much more harm. So that's one of the really important concepts, and again, comes out of Socrates investigating the craftsmen or artisans. So there's that. again, love to hear your thoughts on Socratic wisdom. We could talk about it in discussion boards and also in the recitation day. This comes to the last in terms of most important for what happened in the Apology is Socrates then investigates the politicians. Now, we have to be a little careful here. So, first of all, who are the politicians in ancient Greece in this particular time and place in democratic Athens? Well, who's going to get elected? Those who are persuasive. And this is a group called the Sophists. Now, you might say, wait a minute, doesn't sophist just mean wise person? Well, yes, but that's not actually the proper meaning here. The Sophists were a specific group of people who were private tutors. Now, if you were a private tutor in democratic ancient Athens, if you were hiring a tutor, what would you want them to teach your child? Well, if I'm rich enough to afford a tutor, I'm basically wanting my kids to succeed in my footsteps. In Athens, what does that mean? Well, in a direct democracy with no constitution, that means the people who can persuade the mob that's the skill that you really need to learn to get your way. Then you could have policies shifted in your favor, etc. And so this is a skill called rhetoric. And Socrates is going to distinguish between rhetoric and philosophy, at least implicitly, in terms of goals. What is the goal of rhetoric? Persuasion. That's it. No more, no less. Their goal is to win the argument. That's not the goal of philosophy, and that's not the goal of wisdom. For Socrates, the goal for wisdom, the goal for philosophy is truth. Those two are not the same. I can give a persuasive argument for a conclusion I know is false. And in fact, the Sophists were kind of famous for doing this. If they needed to attract a patron, they'd give incredibly persuasive sounding arguments on both sides of an issue just to show how good they were at it and that the facts didn't actually matter. And Socrates says, well, wait a minute. Dismissing the facts is unwise. True wisdom, we want truth. And so that's why the Sophists were unwise. And let me pause here, and this is one of the reasons I really like to talk about the Apology, is Socrates tells us the unexamined life is not worth living. And it sets up what I like to sometimes call the Socratic challenge, to analyze and evaluate your own beliefs. So take something deeply, dearly held, one of your beliefs, say about politics, ethics, religion, something you're very passionate about. And Socrates says, wisdom requires that you defend and analyze that belief. Ask, why do I believe it? Answer in terms of an argument. Evaluate that argument to determine if you should keep believing that or not. And why I call it the Socratic challenge, it is challenging to put those dearly held beliefs on the dissecting table. But as Socrates presents it, it's a win-win, because one of two things will happen. If you carefully, closely analyze that dearly held belief and find out, wow, I really do have good reasons for believing it's true, and I will continue believing it's true, that's a huge advantage. Why? Because I started with mere opinion, but by performing this careful philosophical analysis, I have moved my belief from mere opinion to something much deeper and richer, what Socrates calls knowledge. So knowledge versus opinion, mere opinion, sorry. And that's valuable. It is really valuable to truly understand why you should believe and why you do believe these things. But what about the other side? Let's say I analyze my closely, dearly held belief and find out, nope, it's junk. I don't have a good argument that achieves the conclusion. Why is that an advantage? Because you'll stop believing a false thing. You'll stop looking like a fool when you defend it in public, and you're just better off for knowing what is true, says Socrates. So it's a win-win. That's why we like philosophy. That's why we're better people for doing it, because when we analyze our dearly held beliefs, we will be better off either way. So Another good thing you could do if you want is a good practice is just try to present an argument for one of your beliefs. Can get a little touchy because you'll sometimes realize they're really bad. So I don't take political positions generally, but I will take factual positions. So let me give an example of a bad argument. I'm not saying anything about the conclusion, but this argument is bad. The argument goes, we should use the death penalty in order to save money. You hear that sometimes. If you analyze that, why is that a bad argument? False premise. Executing someone actually costs considerably more than life in prison, somewhere between $2 to $6 million more per person, depending on the state. Why? A lot of reasons, but lawsuits, having to build a separate wing of the prison, the 2 mandatory appeals before you execute someone. It's way cheaper to pay a prison guard for life than pay lawyers for 10 years. So that's a bad argument. And if you're evaluating your beliefs about the death penalty, realizing that's a bad argument is valuable and important and means you should not use it. Now, if that were the only argument against the argument for the death penalty, we shouldn't accept the death penalty. But there are other arguments, and we'll actually talk about those a little more when we get to the Crito later. But for now, realizing that's a really bad argument, you're better off for it. You can enrich and accommodate it into your belief systems and stop looking like a fool at parties. So that's the win-win of the Socratic challenge. That was an important tangent, but how does this all affect the goings-on of the Apology? Simple. Socrates went to investigate the politicians and figure out why they were not wise as they should have been. And he did this publicly. He did this while people were watching, and basically a bunch of the little rich kids like to go follow Socrates around and just kind of watch him deflate these windbags to show that they were just pursuing rhetoric and didn't actually have a good notion of truth, and he would do this deflationary thing in front of all these little rich kids. Bear in mind, if you were rich enough to follow Socrates around, that means your parents were probably movers and shakers, since you didn't really have to have a craft. And this would kind of be the equivalent of some random person walking into Harvard Law and proceeding to show that their informally educated existence, they knew more about law than all the tenured professors there. Bad. What's worse, now imagine that situation with the kids of the dean, the kids of the president, and the kids of the department chair watching. This was provocative. This was Socrates throwing down a gauntlet. This was going to provoke a response. And he did. In fact, one of his prosecutors was one of these sophists that Socrates made look like a fool in public in front of the kids of all the movers and the shakers. And so Socrates, in doing this, was threatening the sophist way of life. I mean, he was taking food off their table by exposing their true colors and showing what they really were. And so it was going to provoke a reaction, and that reaction was going to be a harsh one. So that, says Socrates, is why we're really here. So this is the pause. This ends the old charges. Socrates irritated the wrong people, like Miletus, and in doing so, he provoked a reaction. The sophists did what they did best. They stirred up the mob with a bunch of BS and lies and persuasive junk to get people turned against Socrates. And that, says Socrates, is the real reason we're here. So that ends the old charges. Next video, I want to tell you some important things to look for, and I really want you to try this. Again, treat this as, your 2-hour assignment between classes you would normally do. next video, we're going to talk about the new charges starting off. And remember, there were two: denying the gods of Athens, corrupting the youth of Athens. Denying the gods of Athens, not terribly important. He just kind of gives a couple of reasons that think that that's not true. We will talk about both those reasons and why it was not important next video. More importantly is the corrupting the youth of Athens, much more serious charge. Socrates gives it way more attention, which you know if you've already read the Apology. And here we're going to start working on pulling arguments out of the text. So there's one charge that we need to talk about still, but he's going to do that with two arguments. And he's going to give an inductive argument on why he doesn't corrupt the youth. And we know it's inductive because it's going to be an analogy-disanalogy thing, and it's going to have to do with horses. Then he's going to give a deductive argument, and we know it's deductive because it's supposed to follow from an either-or. And so what you should do is try to do a couple of things. Watch for them, that is, at least be able to find them in the text. But your real goal, and start doing this before you watch the video, is to try to pull out the argument in the form that we talked about last time, where you just have premise, 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 conclusion. These arguments tend to have three-ish premises. And that's the real goal because, remember, here's a conclusion. I'm not guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens. Here's the argument, which gives the reason you should believe it. And if the argument makes a good inference and has good content, you have to accept the conclusion. And so being able to pull those arguments out of the text is good practice by itself, because philosophy is pretty much nothing but arguments. But then we're going to start talking about how do we evaluate these formally, and what does that commit us to in terms of what we should believe about the situation. So that's what we're doing for next time. So make sure to take your time in between, find those arguments, do the old college try your best to reconstruct those on your own in some way. And there's probably not one exact right answer, but you need to capture kind of the logic and the reasoning, not the words. And we'll see how you did next time.